So How the Word is Passed was born out of the origin story of it began in 2017 when I was watching the Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues to P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and thinking about, how these leaders of the Confederacy were part of the iconography of the entire city. And I was thinking about, well, what did it mean that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people? What did it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that changing a school name or taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee or making Juneteenth a holiday is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it is to say that help all of these things, all of these symbols, help us understand the ecosystem of stories and narratives that have been passed down over the course of generations that shape the very real material realities of what communities look like and better inform us of how to make amends for the harm that has been done to different communities across and throughout American history. And so I was thinking about, well, how does my own city reckon with this history? And then more broadly, thinking about how the country reckons with this history. And so I'm going to share a brief excerpt from the book. Part of what I do is travel to different historical sites throughout the country: Monticello, Angola Prison, Whitney Plantation, New York City, Galveston, Texas, and try to explore, well, what stories are being told, which stories are not being told, and which places are doing something in between. And so I'll read a brief excerpt before we begin our conversation. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung across his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate battle flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of this city, these copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. They call it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But see, the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860, the 4 million enslaved Black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the Black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city that's filled with statues of white men on pedestals and Black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederates and slave owners. Every day, Black children walk into buildings named after people who never wanted them to be there. Every time I return home, I drive on streets named for those who didn't think of me as human. Go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne. In translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of Black soldiers who were trying to surrender. Take a left on the president of the Confederacy who made the torture of Black bodies the cornerstone of his new nation. Make the first right on the man who mounted the heads of rebelling slaves on stakes and spread them across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you?
Clint Smith, good morning to you officially, and welcome to the Community Building Initiatives Breakfast. Thank you so much for being with us and for reading. I can say that I thoroughly enjoyed the book, learned a great deal, and I want to bring you into today's theme. We're talking about reckoning with aftershocks. How do we recommit, reconnect, and rebuild our communities? And when I think about the events of the past 2 years that have really caused people to pause and reflect a little bit more, I think about not only the racial reckoning that happened after the murder of George Floyd, but also think about the Capitol riots, the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on our communities. And I think I want to just ask you, can we truly recommit, reconnect, and rebuild if we don't examine the past?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential to understand the context that created the social conditions of our communities. I think what happens is if you don't, and I write about this a little bit in the book, you have entire generations of young people who grow up thinking that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is somehow a reflection of the people in those communities and not a reflection of the things that have been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. And I saw this, I experienced it as a young Black person growing up in New Orleans. I experienced it as a teacher of young Black and Latino children in Prince George's County, Maryland, where if you don't give young people or any of us the tools and the history and the framework with which to understand how to make sense of the world, to understand how, as the great James Baldwin says in his 1964 essay, A Talk to Teachers, to help the child understand that they are not criminal, but it is in fact the society that created the conditions and the history that created the conditions of their community, that created the community saturated with poverty, that created the conditions in which violence would flourish, that created a lack of opportunity for upward mobility and jobs that pay fair wages and opportunity to move into different communities because of state-sanctioned housing segregation, all of those things. If our young people don't understand that history, then they begin to internalize so many of the disparities that we see manifest themselves in our society and in our cities, and begin to think that there is something wrong with them or there's something wrong with their community. And that's not only for Black and brown children, it's important for white children to be thinking about these things as well, so that all of us collectively can understand how our society has been shaped, so that we can make informed policy decisions about how to make amends for very specific sorts of harm that have been done to groups of people across generations.
I know that in addition to looking around your hometown, you also say the inspiration for this book were those high school students that you taught. And I appreciated reading in the chapter about your visit to Galveston, Texas, how inspired you were to see the young people leading the Juneteenth celebration. And you really make the point there. You reject the fact that if Black youth actually learn about the historical legacy of slavery, that they would be overwhelmed, that instead it's the opposite. As you said, it helps them better understand community.
Yeah, and I think about that all the time. I mean, I think in part because I didn't grow up with a lot of this information. And growing up in New Orleans, you know, I was inundated with these messages, as I was alluding to before, of all the things that were wrong with Black people, all the things that were wrong, that we were doing wrong, and all the things that we needed to do in order to like lift ourselves up so that we weren't experiencing so many of the disparities that exist. And I just didn't have the language and the history and the toolkit to push back against so much of the pathology that we were inundated with. And the nature of our public discourse at that point was very different than the nature of our public discourse now, which has been shifted. Right? There's been a profound shift in our public discourse around history, around sociology, around how we understand the history of this country over the past several years, largely because of the Black Lives Matter movement that has pushed us to more fully account for the conditions and the policies that created our carceral landscape, that created our community landscape, that created our school landscape. And when I saw these young people who, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, equipped with this information that I was just learning as an adult. I just kept thinking, like, how transformative would it have been for me to know this, right? And to not instead, because I didn't know, I felt a sense of emotional and psychological paralysis in some ways, where I knew what I was hearing was wrong. I knew what people were saying about my community was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it was wrong. And then when you don't know how to push back against something, sometimes you begin to internalize. And I think then you begin to internalize and start to believe at its most insidious and worst level some of the things that the world is telling you about yourself. And I think that learning the fullness of American history is something that can really, on both a sort of macro nation state level, but also on a hyper local community level, like learning the history of your community can really disabuse you of the idea that somehow the reason that different parts of the community look the way that they do are the result of singular decisions that people in those communities have made, and again, not the result of a larger set of national, state level, and local policy decisions over time.
Throughout the book, it was interesting to read the reactions of adults who are confronting the past and sometimes finding it was different than what they grew up with. I thought it was interesting, the two women who visited Monticello, and I think told you that some of the shine that they had always put on Thomas Jefferson was removed as they learned about his connections to slavery. And then I thought it was interesting, the owner of the Whitney plantation, where they have really put the story of enslaved people at the forefront. When you visit there, he talked about his discovered ignorance. But then going to the Memorial Day service that was hosted by the Sons of Confederate Veterans at Blandford Cemetery, you found people who didn't want to consider that what they had grown up believing was actually true. And I want to ask you, from all of those experiences and those conversations that you had with people, why do you think it is so difficult for us to confront discrepancies in the history we learned and really think about what it means to believe that maybe it was not true? What we've been told throughout our lives was not true.
I think that, and we were talking about this before, I wish we had an hour to talk about this and not 20 minutes, but because there's so much there. I think that part of what happens is, in this country, we have a difficult time holding multiple and often contradictory truths, in the sense that, for example, Thomas Jefferson is, embodies, I think, so many of the contradictions of America, in the sense that America is a place that's provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have simply never imagined. But it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here or one over here. It's that they are deeply entangled in one another. And I think Jefferson similarly sort of personifies that cognitive dissonance, where he is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his children. He wrote in one document, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and wrote in another text, Notes on the State of Virginia, that Black people are inherently inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. Didn't believe the slave was capable of love, didn't believe that enslaved people were capable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. And so you have to hold both of those things as true when you think of Jefferson, right? You have to hold the idea that he is foundational to the project of the American experiment, and that he also perpetuated human bondage, knowing that it was wrong, but doing it anyway. And I think that people have a hard time sitting with stories about America that run counter to the stories they have grown up with. Because I think so many people's identities and sense of self are tied to a specific story of America. And when you begin to tell a new story of this country, a more expansive story, a more honest story, right? When you begin not to only talk about Jefferson as the person who wrote the Declaration of Independence, but also the person who wrote Notes on the State of Virginia. people attempt to say like, oh, you're trying to indoctrinate students, or you're trying to like push a set of political dispositions, and really you're just trying to tell a fuller story than has been told. But for many people, that represents an existential crisis, because I think about my time at the Confederate Cemetery, and a guy named Jeff, who was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans when I was there, he was telling me about how his granddaddy used to take him to that cemetery, and they would sit in the gazebo, and they would watch the dragonflies at night and the deer scamper through. And his grandfather would sing him songs of Old Dixie and tell him stories of the 30,000 men buried in this cemetery who fought a war not for slavery, but for their communities, to protect their families. And now Jeff passes those stories along to his children. And so when Jeff is forced to confront, primary source documents or empirical evidence that the Confederacy indeed seceded from the Union because of slavery and fought the Civil War because of slavery, in which there are a plethora of those documents. If you look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession in 1861, a state like Mississippi says very explicitly, our position is thoroughly aligned with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Right? So they're not vague about why they're seceding, like all the other states are quite clear. But for Jeff, it is not simply a matter of like having to reassess a new history. It is a threat to who he understands his grandfather to be. It is a threat to how he understands the very foundation of their relationship. And as a result, it is a threat to who he understands himself to be. And so I think it is profoundly difficult, because so many people's sense of who they are is tied to a series of lies about this country. And that, as a human, that is a hard thing to navigate. But that's not to say that you shouldn't do it. I think we all have stories we've been told as young people by our families that then we grow up and have to say, well, actually, the story that we were told is maybe a little different than the one that's true. But and so we have to confront that.
It's complex, and sometimes we like the simple. I want to ask you maybe some advice that you might have for those who are listening to us now, for our local leaders who are really reckoning with some of our local history as well. And I know that you were a student at Davidson. Don't know if you're familiar with Latta Plantation, but it was recently closed after advertising a Juneteenth celebration, and some of the social media posts promised to tell the story of defeated Confederate soldiers and a slave owner who was chased out of his home by the Yankees. And then we also have Charlotte's Legacy Commission that has identified 9 streets in the city that they are going to rename because they honored slaveholders or those who supported the Confederacy. And our local school district has renamed 2 schools, one that was named for a slaveholder, another that was named for a white supremacist. So we have local leaders who are really looking around our community with a different lens, and wonder if you have any advice for them as they begin that journey.
Yeah, well, I'm heartened to hear that those changes are underway. And I think 2 things. I think I would say it's important to think of the school name changes, or the taking down of monuments, the changing of the names of spaces, as an entry point to a larger set of issues, right? Like, it doesn't begin and end with the renaming of a school. Like, after you rename a school, the school will not like be shed of its of the residue of racism that shaped what the sort of outcomes that school is experiencing. It's a question also of resources. It's a question also of what sort of lessons are our students being taught in these schools. And I think we're in this really fraught political moment where we have this sort of critical race theory boogeyman that is being willfully distorted and wielded as a weapon to push back against a very profound shift in public consciousness that has happened over the past several years, in which more people have begun to understand the history of racism, not as just an interpersonal phenomenon, but as a structural one, as a systemic one, as a historical one, as one that is deeply embedded in the story of this country. And I think that all it is trying to do is give us a fuller story with which to understand the country we live in. And so I think that I would encourage our community leaders to not succumb to the boogeyman that is being wielded and sort of pushed around to suggest that students are being indoctrinated. Because there's a difference between a teacher trying to indoctrinate a students with their own beliefs, and then versus trying to expand a student's set of what they understand as truth, right? When you talk to bring it back to Jefferson, when you talk about Jefferson, when you talk about what Jefferson wrote on his notes on the state of Virginia about Black people, that's not indoctrinating students with a set of political beliefs. Actually an intellectually and academically more rigorous task for them to do, is to sit with the sort of contradictions of one of the people who was central to the founding of this country. And so, on one end, I would encourage people to push back against so much of the rhetoric that is emanating from that space. And then, secondly, with regard to monuments and sort of iconography, one of the things that I'm interested in is, like, are we building monuments to individuals, or are we building monuments to communities? Are we building monuments to, like, groups of people? Because we know, as tempting as it is to, like, make everything to orient large moments of social change to single people or single heroic individuals, what we know is that social change happens in every facet across generations from large groups of ordinary people doing remarkable things. And so, I admire MLK as much as the next guy. I admire Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and I talk about this in the book. Like, what would it look like to have monuments to just, like, ordinary community members, right? People who were, like, central to that block, people who were central to that neighborhood, and making it not even just one statue, but like a group. Some of my favorite statues are like groups of people, are statues of families. In Washington, D.C., there's a statue at the African American Civil War Museum. And it's an African American family. And on the other side, it's a group of African American soldiers. And on the other side, and so it's reflective of the communal nature of change. And the last point on this, we often memorialize and create monuments to our past, but what would it look like to create memorials and monuments to our future and to our aspirations? Like, what would having markers that are orienting us toward where we're trying to go look like? What would it, and I'm not an artist, so there are all sorts of ways that artists could create this, but, like, memorials to justice, memorials to equality, memorials to empathy, right? Like, what if we had those as part of our landscape, as these sort of daily reminders? How might that orient the direction that we're going as communities, as much as we use the past to orient us as well?
I love you for casting that vision right there and just really reminding us all that we live in community. As you mentioned at the beginning, I wish we had more time, but I'm going to close us out with some of your words. And you really close out the book also by quoting a historian that says, the problem with the memory of slavery is that we have too many gaps in our memory. And then you go on and say, in order for our country to collectively move forward, it is not enough to have a patchwork of places that are honest about this history while being surrounded by other spaces that undermine it. It must be a collective endeavor to learn and confront the story of slavery and how it has shaped the world we live in today. And then you go on to say, at some point, it is no longer a question of whether we can learn this history, but whether we have the collective will to reckon with it. I want to thank you for working to fill in some of our gaps with your work and how the word is passed. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.